Hello, Dishdele. I would like to thank the organizers for Future of Tibet conference for having me. So I'm just going to get into it. So I was asked to kind of speak on my perspective on the future from the exile point of view and my research experience on regards to the future of Tibet. So I kind of wanted to start with I was asked to come as a speaker for the 550 conference that happened in 2018. And at the time, they wanted me to come up with a line of issues that the Tibetan government had outlined and wanted me to give my thoughts on such challenges. The challenges that they were talking about was the issue of a unified stance, the fact that there was a lot of disagreements between the Tibetan community and the rise of factionalism in the Tibetan community. And at the time, I said, although I did not have any specific prescriptive solutions for these problems, I did emphasize the importance of understanding the beginning of exile, how we need to actually engage the history of what happened in early exile and the fact that we were faced with certain issues that was met by the kind of leadership that His Holiness was able to bring. So just to quickly kind of outline what these issues were, at the beginning of exile, we were faced with the issue of war in Tibet, which was invasion, and then the exodus of Tibetan refugees coming into exile. At the time, His Holiness had to face the twin challenges of the invasion inside Tibet and the crisis of refugees happening in India. And how these challenges were met was through the leadership of His Holiness. Under his leadership, His Holiness was able to kind of form a guiding, united vision, which was this emphasis on a return to Tibet and seeing exile as a framework for preparing for this kind of future return of Tibet. And in many ways, he restructured the Tibetan government. He democratized the structure of the Tibetan government to have equal representation within the Tibetan government structure through the parliament, and eventually devolving his power to make the position of the Sikyong based on elections. So I think in many ways His Holiness had a long-term view of how to approach these, and with the fact that we had a unified vision in many ways helped to kind of garner the kind of camaraderie and solidarity between Tibetans despite differences in politics and past histories of differences. At the time, Tibetans were able to unify on the fact that we had a common problem, which was the invasion of Tibet, and needed a common solution, which was a return for Tibet. And in many ways, His Holiness prepared for that by the making of institutions, the creation of settlements in the south, and the making of cultural, social, and political institutions. By that I mean the making of the Tibetan government, the creation of the educational institutions and cultural institutions such as the Nobralinka and Tiba. In many ways, these were efforts to not only organize Tibetan communities into efforts of preserving the Tibetan culture, but also creating avenues for political advocacy from such efforts. A lot of this culminated with the Tibetan community, surviving the initial stage of exile through the making of such institution, and not only surviving but thriving in exile. And from the 1970s forward, His Holiness internationalized the issue of Tibet, politicized it, and now we have the global political movement for Tibet. In many ways, it was spearheaded by His Holiness's leadership. So these challenges of early exile, which was of invasion, refugeehood, and the humanitarian crisis it was generating, it was met by a certain kind of leadership by His Holiness with the guiding united principles of a vision of a return to Tibet, and in many ways emphasizing the fact that we were all in the same boat and we all were being, oppressed by the same enemy. So these were points that Tibetans agreed on and met on, and built a solid political movement based off of these points that we did actually come together on. And I think these things need to be emphasized even now, despite current issues. So I kind of want to emphasize these early histories to think through how we should meet current challenges. I want to focus on what is working right now that I find productive in as far as advocacy is concerned from the exile point of view. Currently, I think that the move to, like, for example, I noticed that Sigyong Penpa has put in the effort to create bilateral interest between different parliamentarians. Like, for example, he had that meeting in DC where parliamentarians who are pushing advocacy on top when it comes to Tibet in their own parliament structures. By that I mean the EU, Canada, UK, Australia, coming together to kind of build a unifying kind of lobbying effort on behalf of Tibet advocacy. I think, and what came out of that later was the U.S. I think it was Governor, one of the MPs, U.S. MP, John McGovern, who is currently he's proposed a new bill in the Parliament in the U.S. proposing the revoking of the One China policy. What that means is, currently, a lot of the governments recognize Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Tibet as part of China, hence the One China policy. This proposal that is currently being proposed in the U.S. Congress could become the framework for what could become standard. Like if this passes in the U.S. Congress, this could be huge. It's a huge move. It means the U.S. no longer will consider Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Tibet as part of China, and this could be a jumping and modeling framework for what could happen in the Canadian parliament structure, the EU parliament structure, the UK and Australia, so on and so forth. So I think these are efforts that are extremely exciting, and we should be paying close attention to these things and how we can achieve these such moves to become adopted within the U.S. system. And I think that a lot of that is dependent on grassroots lobbying efforts, so activism in lobbying your representatives. Especially, I think right now is the time for Tibetans who are citizens of these countries. Like, I'm a U.S. citizen, so Tibetan Americans can push their representatives to make these a reality. And if this becomes adopted by the U.S. Congress, it could become the framework for what could happen in the EU, Canada, UK, so on and so forth. I think that's a new development that needs to be followed through, and activism on the grassroots level needs to be focused on this. I also think the move by Tibetan Canadians, British Tibetans, Tibetan Americans to enter American politics as politicians is another opportunity. For example, I find Putla Karpuche's rise in the parliament structure in Canada extremely exciting. She just became the deputy speaker of the parliament right now, and I don't think that's a coincidence. Currently, the Canadian government is dealing with Chinese interferences in their elections and espionage activities on Canadian soil. And I don't think that it is a coincidence that Ottawa is also pushing to kind of push new legislation that tries to, counteract such activities by the Chinese government in Canada with new moves on their own. So I don't think it's a coincidence that Putila Karpuche is currently the secretary, deputy Speaker of the House currently. So I think we need to be following these kinds of developments and encourage more Tibetan Canadians and Tibetan Americans to enter Tibetan American and Canadian and European parliament structures to push forward certain kinds of policies that could be bilateral interests. And by that I mean interests that Canada and, for example, Canada and Tibetans align on. For example, the issue of Chinese espionage activities on Canadian soil. It doesn't only affect Canadian governing structures, but it also affects Tibetan communities. As we know, Chinese espionage activities have always targeted Tibetans. We've known this through Chinese activities on the Tibetan government for a very long time. And I think it's interesting and exciting that foreign governments are realizing that the Chinese espionage activities are affecting their government also, and it's detrimental for their government to meet these challenges at this point. And I think these could be bilateral interests that Tibetan political advocacy needs to be paying attention to. So I'd like to emphasize these things as new developments that we should be encouraging and supporting. I also feel like Tibetan activism, as we know it, is going from a shift from influencing culture, and by that I mean from the 80s, from His Holiness's activities to the move by Tibetan communities in the 90s in the U.S. has created larger awareness of the Tibetan political cause and issue. And so, we have influenced global Western culture on how Tibet should be talked about politically and culturally. And I think currently the activism is now shifting into these parliament structures, developments that I've already just kind of outlined. So I think we need to acknowledge this shift and welcome such shifts and support and push such shifts. And I think there needs to be more activism within, for me, within the American government. So, like I said, I think the revocation of the one China policy, we need to be pushing such efforts, and that seems to be something that's already happening, but the larger public seems to be much more embroiled in communal disagreements, that these information seems to be kind of getting lost. So I think we need to be emphasizing these things, and these are interests that all Tibetans align on, and I think it also becomes a good basis for creating a unified kind of advocacy that we all agree on. Current challenges seems to be the issue of unity and the rise of factionalism. To me, it's highly. I think these are happening because we have had a momentous change in leadership. We have gone from a leadership, a Tibetan government that was historically ruled by the institution of the Dalai Lamas, the last one being the 14th. He resigned and was able to kind of create the Tibetan government into a democratically elected system where we vote for our own leadership. And on the one hand, this gives us opportunities, but on the other hand, it has given us new challenges. I think the rise in factionalism and how it's contributing to a lack of unification within the Tibetan community is intimately related to this change of leadership. And I think that we should acknowledge this. and I think that's okay. But I also think that one way of kind of looking at how to meet these challenges is actually, again, going back to what I've said earlier, which is that we were faced with more challenging situations in 1959, and we need to look at how His Holiness met such challenges with his own leadership. At the time, we were met with the issue of invasion and exile. I feel like these are much bigger problems compared to the issue of lack of unity right now. And I think one of the ways that we can meet these challenges of lack of unity is a kind of unified kind of politics where we all align. And I think when it comes to what's happening in Tibet and how China is approaching not only Tibet and the rest of the world, that is something all Tibetans agree on. Having a unified ground from which to meet these challenges of Chinese rise in, empire building. These are also challenges that other countries, not only Tibetans, are faced with right now. And these do become common grounds for how we can form a certain kind of political advocacy. So I do think that we should be considering these things. So I hope you guys have a fruitful discussion and I'm able to offer some level of insights that could create a pathway for us to have like common grounds on how to shape a new kind of advocacy on behalf of Tibet moving forward. Thank you for this opportunity, and I wish everybody luck in having fruitful discussions. Thank you.